Welcome to Steve Nallon Ghost Stories. This episode, a titillating tale of spooky seductiveness as told by the ghost of Kenneth Williams, visiting Hattie.
The backstory to the inspiration of visiting Hattie is that I love old movies and stuff. So I have in my bathroom a load of black and white pictures of movie stars. But I also like the carry-on. So I've got Charles Hawtrey and I've got the lovely Kenneth Williams. And these, appropriately enough, are just above the loo. Anyway, a friend of mine called Adam, who comes and stayed with me, he went to the loo, came down and says, Steve, I can't go. I said, what do you mean you can't go? I said, why can't you go? He said, well, Hattie keeps looking at me because right above the loo, I've got a picture of Hattie Jacques. So anyway, I was preparing the ghost stories. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting idea, because what Adam says was she's got these eyes and you can sort of see it. They sort of follow you around the room. And he had this sense that even when he was washing his hands, she was still looking at him. The tradition of haunted portraits actually goes back to one of the very first horror books, Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. And Manfred sees his grandfather, Ricardo, sort of breathing heavily in the picture and sighing heavily in the picture. And then he steps out of the picture, does the ghost. He quit the panel and descended on the floor with a grave and melancholy air. And it's classic Gothic, is that. And what you have is the grandfather basically establishing the doom of the family that is to come. And also the sort of ancestral curse, which is also very, very, very Gothic. Horace Walpole, actually his father was Sir Robert Walpole, who turns up in one of my other stories, The Return of the Handbag. Anyway, a couple more haunted paintings, haunted pictures. Edgar Allan Poe. There's a great one called the Oval Portrait, and that is about a man who's obsessed with painting, and he paints his wife, but he neglects his wife so much that she dies, but her life comes into the oval portrait. And it's one of those Edgar Allan Poe stories that is really about obsession. And his other one is a very early one, which very rarely turns up in collections, that I have it in this one. It's called Metzengerstein, and it's very similar to the Horace Walpole story of ancestors fighting each other. Another one I discovered was Lovecraft. It's actually in a book. Is this? The picture is inside a book which a man finds in a house. It's called The Picture in the House. It's a dodgy one nowadays because it's racist and it's about cannibals and stuff. But it's an interesting one, and I mention it because it's in a book, which leads us to M.R. James and M.R. James's first ghost story. Canon Olberich's scrapbook, and when Canon Olberich eventually gets hold of the scrapbook, he has this real sense that the picture inside, which was drawn from life, is actually standing over his shoulder. He's constantly from then on looking over his shoulder. It's a very literally haunting image, and you can see it here in James McBride's sort of illustration, which he did. Another M.R. James sort of haunted picture is the Mezzotint, which I think is one of his finest ghost stories. And I've sort of borrowed that, or there's a Mezzotint in my own M.R. James sort of tribute, the portrait of a looking glass. One final one, which I think is really worth mentioning, is by a man called Hume Nisbet, and he was a Scottish painter. And he also did ghost stories, and he wrote this wonderful, well, actually probably my favorite of all the portrait stories, which is called The Old Portrait. And he finds this old portrait of this woman, and she's very pale, pallid lips, and then her eyes come towards him, and he's mesmerized, and he goes into a dream, and he senses all the life coming out of him. And eventually he wakes up, and then he sees the picture, and her lips are red, blood red, and blood is dripping down. So it's a it's the only vampire haunted portrait I could find, but it's a really good one. And then, you know, there's others, like I think Stephen King wrote one called Rose Madder, and so what I'm saying is there's a huge tradition here of the haunted portrait.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about Dorian Gray, and thinking about how paintings really are. Obviously, everyone is snapping photographs of every single moment of every day now, but these portraits, to capture a moment in time or an idealized version of what you hope you look like, possibly in some cases, it's interesting to kind of reflect on that maybe we're not surrounded by physical paintings of things watching us all the time, but we are definitely still of a mind where we're constantly reflecting and looking at pictures. We're constantly almost haunted by images of ourselves.
There's a positive one there in Coco. You know, the Disney one. Now, that it's not so much that the picture or the photograph is haunted. It's the fact that by having it on your wall, by having it there all the time, you are maintaining the spirit of your ancestors. And I think that's and just over in the corner is my grandfather, and I didn't have a picture of him in my little office until I'd watched Coco, and I went up into the attic and found a picture of him to make sure that he'd sort of still in my memory. But the Hattie Jacques one, well, most of the stories that I mentioned, Horace Walpole, M.R. James, they're rather macabre, and I wanted to sort of do the opposite. So I wanted to write a funny one. And really, Visiting Hattie is a celebration of Hattie Jacques. She loved life, she loved sex, she loved men, she loved laughter, and she loved food. And I really, not all ghost stories need to be horror. And I was really keen to, and it was the first one I wrote some time ago now. And I read, I'm going to give a plug to my friend Andy Merriman, whose father I worked with, whose father was a writer. He wrote a radio series called Beyond Our Ken, and I worked with him on a 10 series with Mike Yarwood back in the 1980s. Anyway, Andy's a wonderful biographer, and I read this book, and I just, everybody loved her. You know, everybody, there was not one word said against her. And
that's true.
It was and her everybody, the Carry On people used to go to her house for Christmas dinner, and she used to cook about 6 puddings, and you know, it was so it's a story. And then anyway, it developed. I had to have, you know, somebody who had the picture. I had to decide where it was, and of course, since it's in my loo, I had to be in their loo. So I came up with these a couple of gay bears that love the Carry On movies, and Hattie Jacques in particular.
Of the reverence, and everybody has a favorite, you know, Carry On film that they want to talk about and disagree in a fun way about. It's nice to have a spiritual presence that's a real positive and fun kind of, exactly like you just said. I that's what I enjoy about this story. I was going to ask you a question about it as well, because obviously I'm a massive Kenneth Williams fan, and I waded through all his diaries, and like you say, he had no bad words. He has bad words for everyone, and then sometimes he changes his mind, and he's very up and down. But Hattie Jacques, absolutely, he loved her to bits. the way that he tells the stories is vital, isn't it, to the way that this story comes across on the page. So, for example, for people who might not know about Polari, and obviously there's an appendix in the book that does take you through some of the words. Maybe for people who are, because it's made its way into everyday speech, that we all use, but we might not know. Is there something about that maybe you could just give us a little bit of a taste of, just to kind of explain what that is, how sometimes he uses Polari words?
Well, it came from, I mean, there's a whole history, which as you say, there's an appendix in the book. But Kenneth Williams was one of the first characters I impersonated. And, he's such a wonderful one to do, the nostrils flaring. And in the late 60s, when I sort of got to know, a little bit Kenneth Williams, there was a series on the radio called Round the Horn, with characters called Julian and Sandy, played by Hugh Paddick and Kenneth Williams. And they used Polari all the time. And it was, oh, look, it's Mr. Oh, now, Bona to Vada, your dolly old eek. And what that means is how good it is to see your lovely old face. Bona. And that's actually a word that is in Shakespeare, actually, believe it or not.
Right.
To Vada, to see your dolly old eek, your dolly old face. And there's lots of other ruder words in Polari.
Yes.
And they sometimes got into Round the Horn when they shouldn't have done,
Right. It's a bit naughty.
And those are explained in the book. But it was a sort of a cultural gay language of the 1940s and 50s primarily. It had began to disappear by the late 60s. And I'd always been fascinated by it. In fact, I've done a stage show about it called In the Life. And I always loved the words. They're a mixture of Romany and Latin and Yiddish. And you mentioned naff, for example. Naff is a Polari word. So
camp as well, yeah. Camp.
Yeah, there's loads of them that.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is, and it borrowed from so many traditions. And one of the most bizarre traditions it borrowed from was a way of speaking that I think came from the markets of the Cockney markets, where you reverse the letters in the word. So hair became raya.
Okay.
And it was a way of speaking, so you didn't. So those that could speak it didn't communicate what they were thinking to the person sat next to them, who might have been a policeman.
How interesting.
So you get Omi Palome, which is a homosexual, and Carts. Oh, Vader is Carts, which means look at his, his penis line, basically. And of course, people could use this language in public without anybody really knowing what they were saying.
Got you.
And look at the Nanty Potts means he has no teeth. Oh, Nanty Potts. And
it does kind of sound funny as well. There's a humor to it. I guess if you're looking for some sort of, to keep things private and if you feel like you might be in danger and still, but also keep an element of fun to what you're doing. I was thinking it's a bit like Carney talk when they're trying to not let the mark in on the fact that they're tricking them, or in wrestling where they would use, or even in America, like people using pig Latin. There's a kind of, this is our way of conversating that does not allow you, the person right next to you, to know what we're talking about.
And some of them are funny. I mean, one of my favourites is the police are referred to either as Lily Law. Oh, it's Lily Law. or Betty Bracelets, which I think is
That's
really
great.
inventive. Betty,
Yeah.
oh, it's Betty Bracelets.
It takes the power away, doesn't it, as well? It takes the power.
Absolutely. It's a subversive language. And so I came up with this character who I call Billy Blooming, who speaks exclusively in Polari and doesn't really take any prisoners. He doesn't try to explain what he's saying. He's slightly out of his time, but I didn't care. I just wanted to celebrate this language, and I had to be careful writing it, because as you read it, even if you don't know the words, the context allows you to sort of work out what he's saying. And if you need actually to work out what he's saying, there's a sort of I've put a lexicon thing in the back of the book.
Yeah,
but
I really enjoyed that.
Billy Blooming turned out to be so popular with several of my friends that said this is just the most wonderful, wonderful character. And he's always in drag as well. That's the other thing. He always dresses as Bette Davis or Joan Crawford. And you've got to bring him back. So he turns up in another story called I Was Once a Haunted House. But he came back by popular demand, as they say, oh, bone at a party or dolly o'deek, Billy Blooming.
Steve, set up the extract reading for this week's story.
Well, Visiting Hattie is a haunted portrait story, but it's also a haunted house story. And in those tales, normally about halfway through, you get some sort of medium or clairvoyant that sort of turns up and helps and explains stuff. Tangina is the most famous, I think, in Poltergeist, but there's one in The Shining and Paranormal Activity and Starvacre and Lake Mungo and The Orphanage and the others and Hereditary and The Changeling and The Haunting. The list goes on. Anyway, in mine, it's Billy Blooming, our Polari speaking guy, and who was actually basically bought them the portrait, and he turns up when Hattie has been misbehaving herself.
Oh dear, something had obviously upset Hattie, but what could it be? At that very moment the doorbell rang, ding dong, and Adam and Calvin remembered they had invited Billy Blooming round for tea. Wednesday, sweethearts. Well, a girl's M-line's got to show some respect for the midweek. Nishty Gilda, think Bet Davis in Little Foxes. Oh, but your auntie's had a long day on her laddies, so off with the slingbacks, vogue me up, and mine's a Vera. Billy, from time to time, had employment as a spirit medium, and so it was he who had predicted and indeed facilitated at his arrival in Adam and Calvin's lives. Perhaps Billy could explain these strange, phantasmical transgressions. As Adam and Calvin sat round a large pot of Earl Grey tea, with that accompanying large gin for Billy, the homely couple began to tell their guest what had happened, and their suspicions as to the offender. And I say, began, for they never completed their testimony. You see, just as Calvin was pointing out the very neat stitching between the lips of Charles Hawtrey and Bernie Breslau, a more incongruous couple one cannot imagine, the bra on the plastic model of Barbara Windsor suddenly, and seemingly of its own free will, flew off, and up into the air. The novelty plaything had been given pride of place in the centre of the kitchen table, but now the model was semi-naked, and so the arms of Miss Windsor reached across her chest to protect her modesty. Meanwhile, the spinning brazier hovered about, as if deciding where to land, and eventually chose the top of Barbara's head. Yet the bra continued in its tailspin, and the caps, though not designed for this usage, became as if the blades of a helicopter, and as a result the whole of body of Miss Windsor rose into the air like an ascending goddess and began to fly and dart about the room. Billy clapped and cheered at this remarkable psychical phenomenon happening right there in front of his eyes. Oh, Duchess Gloria, so very bold. Not since Mother's Lungo chats with Mary Queen of Scots, brought to a premature end by an unfortunate incident with a meat cleaver, did I regard such wonderments. Don't encourage her, said Adam firmly. Hattie has been very mischievous, added Calvin. Oh, but observe her, Ducky, how she's making Barbara Windsor flutter about like a little sparrow in charper of a nest. However, the couple were more interested in why it was that Hattie had suddenly taken on these poltergeistian tendencies.
Could I see the master of the house?
It's Carry On Screaming.
What now?
It's Carry On Screaming.
This week's film pairing, I've chosen Carry On Screaming. What other film could I choose than Carry On Screaming for Visiting Hattie? Although she's not in it, she is so well known for the series of films. And this, for me, is a bit of an outlier for the Carry On films. If I was to recommend one for someone to watch, maybe who hadn't seen any of them, it stands on its own. If you've watched a Hammer film, you'll get something out of this, I think. It doesn't have Sid James in it. It doesn't have Hattie Jacques, as I said, but it has a very fun, overacting Harry H. Corbett, which is unusual. So if you're not a Carry On fan, this might be more accessible in a strange sort of way. I think it's got all of the brilliant cast of characters that we've come to know if you are a fan. The wonderful Jim Dale, Kenneth Williams, of course. It's got Charles Hawtrey, the fantastic Bernard Bresslaw, underrated Bernard Bresslaw, I feel. But then it's also got Peter Butterworth, who possibly even more underrated, who I just, I just love. But then we've got Fenella Fielding, John Pertwee. It's such a great cast. It's willing to laugh at something that was very popular at the time, the Hammer films, poke fun at it in a really gentle way, and it's just so much fun. I hope you agree with it as my film pairing. What are your thoughts on this film?
Well, I mean, the two gay bears in my Visiting Hattie story, they sort of meet or they fall in love as they're watching Carry On Screaming. So you're right, it just had to be. I mean, I've always loved it. You're right. It's sort of atypical of the Carry Ons. It looks very different. The cinematographer, Alan Hume, had actually worked on Hammer and Amicus. So that look, that sort of slightly greeny, browny look that you sometimes get in the Hammer horrors, it looks just fantastic. And of course, it's got Jekyll and Hyde, it's got House of Wax, it's got the Mummy, it's got Werewolf, it's got the Brides of Dracula. It's pretty much ticks the boxes for every horror fan, and it's also very, very funny and some classic lines. I mean, Fenella Fielding, do you mind if I smoke? It's just one of the classics, and there's even merchandise now for Frying Tonight. I don't know what Kenneth Williams would have made of the fact that he's all over T-shirts, and
yes,
and I've obviously I stole that line as a gag in my Visiting Hattie. And also it sort of connects to, there's a little scene where I think it's Peter Butterworth is looking at a portrait on the wall and says, those eyes are alive, and they are, because Fenella Fielding as Valeria, I think, is behind them in through a peephole. So
Yes.
it's even got a sort of a portrait that's alive, and it's, you know, it takes, I was going to say steals, it's wrong. It takes comedy traditions like the Who's on First, and it turns it into what. You know, what's his name? What is his name and stuff, which I've stolen equally.
Well, I mean, if you think about the Abbott and Costello meets,
Absolutely.
you know, all these different, you know, the werewolf and meets Bela Lugosi, and these were supremely popular, and there wasn't really a British equivalent. So this feels very fresh, doesn't it?
It does, and it works because it's not dated. The only thing that's dated about it is the opening song, which sounds very, very 60s. But because it's classic in its hammer look, it hasn't really dated, because there's a couple of gags that people would probably struggle with today if they were very young, because they wouldn't know the Steptoe tune. So the Harry H. Corbett being in Steptoe and Son, you occasionally hear that. And another one, which is more obscure, which is da 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 da, which is the Z Car themes from the 1960s.
So, yeah, Everton fans might know it, but
yeah, absolutely. So that's its modern cultural reference. But yeah, absolutely. So there's loads of lovely little gags.
Yes,
and it's you know it's a great script, loads of transformations in it, and actually there are some moments which are pretty creepy. I wouldn't say scary, but they're pretty creepy.
No.
When they're coming in towards the house and the gargoyle is above, and Bernard Bresslaw absolutely plays it straight.
Yes, and he can do that so well. You know, a lot of people don't realize what an incredible straight actor he was. What, you know, sort of a highly trained and such a perfectionist he was, because his characters often were like, Sid, like there wasn't.
So there's a wonderful scene in Carry On Screaming where his whole backstory is in the quiver of a lip, when I think he says something like, "You won't send me back there," and he's lipped, and you sort of know that he's come from this horrible place. That and it's a tiny moment, but it tells you everything about that character. And now he's as you say, Peter Butterworth and Bernie Bresslaw, you know, very not underrated in the business, because I think people know how good they are, but less well known as, you know, you Sid James, Kenny Connor, and all that lot are much better known. But and actually it was great to see Peter Butterworth, because sometimes in the Carry Ons he's only got one scene or something, so it was great to see him have and the wonderful Charles Hawtrey. And it's not so much Polari, but there's a tiny bit of rhyming slang in that scene. When he talks about the plates, when he's looking up and he sees the plates,
and he's added, isn't he? He's added to it later on.
He's added to it later on because the Americans wanted him. But in that scene with the plates, it's because plates is rhyming slang for plates of meat, feet. Yeah, the Americans said, "Where is he?" Because he wasn't in the script. So I think that scene was either added or they found a way of getting it. And he filmed it all in one day, and I think he was sober, so it worked out quite well.
He's quite a sad. Dan is quite a sad. I think quite a sad character, and like you said, there's a little bit of pathos to to this film in places, and that's one of them. I don't know. There's just something about that character that tugs at the heartstrings, but maybe there's just something about him as a person when he's
very
more
lonely. It's a very lonely character, isn't he? Sort of underground.
And maybe that tied in with him as a person in real life as well. There's that kind of. I felt like there was something really genuine in there that wasn't broad or played for laughs, or you know.
I think you're right.
It was, yeah.
the style is Harry H. Corbett overdoes it a little bit, but genuinely, the style is to match what has come before, and you can see that in the way that Kenneth Williams' makeup works, because it was designed to be very similar to Ernest Thesiger in The Old Dark House, and you can see in this picture, you know, the shading under the eyes from the Old Dark House is James Whale's Old Dark House is there in Kenneth Williams.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because obviously there's those very British touch points in here. Like we said, the Americans want certain things. There's references to the Addams Family. There's references to a very British style of horror as well. So it probably is the most accessible Hammer related. No, it's not Hammer, is it? So there's references to the Addams Family. There's references to very British horror convention. And it's probably one of the most accessible Carry On films for that reason, I'd say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think you're right. It's the one to recommend if you've never seen one before. So when my friend Adam comes to stay, we talk about visiting Hattie as the euphemism for spending a penny. And she really does look, I can see what he means, really. And I did some research on portraits, and there's a portrait of a woman called Henrietta Nelson that is meant to sort of follow you around the room and move her face a bit. And I do remember back in the 80s, there was the Crying Boy, which there were houses got burnt down, but the Crying Boy survived. And everybody thought that was a bit freaky. And it turned out actually that the painting had been covered with a fire-resistant veneer and was upside down. So there was an explanation
Explainable.
For it. Anyway, explainable. But but look, here's what Scott did with his art. I mean, he said to me, he said, "Do you mind if I put a matron, thing on it?" I said, "Yeah, do what you like." And this is his brilliance. So when I saw it, I rang him up and I said, the colours are absolutely right for the period. Slightly, very sort of late 50s. And he's such a great artist. He didn't just do a caricature of Hattie Jacques. He said, this is when it would have been drawn. These are the colours that were being used by artists in that period, and that's what I'm going to do. And we did some research as to who possibly could have done it, and there's a little V for Vetch, who's one of the nicknames of I think one of the art directors or somebody involved in the production of the Carry On. So there's a lot of nice detail in the artwork, and as I say, it goes back to Carry On movies themselves.
This week's story pairing for Visiting Hattie, Steve, what have you chosen?
Well, it's from the second ghost story book put together by Lady Cynthia Asquith, and it's called The Story of Don Juan by V.S. Pritchett. And basically, Don Juan turns up and he's put in a haunted bed. And it's known for having the ghost is known for having very, very cold hands in this haunted bed. Anyway, he's put in the haunted bed. The person downstairs listens all night and hears all this noise going on. And next morning, Don Juan comes down very happy and but confused by this. So the man who owns the bed decides to sleep in it himself. But then he discovers that the ghost's hands are no longer freezing. They're fiery hot. And it's just a sweet little tale. And it's sort of quite funny. It's got a silly punchline. And I chose it because there are so few funny ghost stories.
True.
I've found a couple over the years, but Oliver Onions writes some fun ones that aren't too serious. But they were a rarity, and I didn't know how that story was going to end, and I thought it was a good gag. My obscure but fascinating fact is that Fenella Fielding in Carry On Screaming wanted a ruby ring for her character, Valeria.
Right.
But the costume budget had been used up. So she had to buy the ruby ring herself, which cost £9, and she kept to the end of her life.
Oh, that's a lovely little story. Oh, that's nice. Well, mine isn't as lovely. It does relate to Carry On Screaming. It's almost fact-checking something that I'd read, and you can commonly find quite easily about Kenneth Williams. So when Kenneth Williams, his character, you may notice that he is a brother and sister, the brother and sister in the story, and he's Dr. Orlando Watt, and we've got Valeria Watt. Now, the reason for that, I go back to 1965. I go to Sunday, the 31st of October in Kenneth Williams's diaries. And he says, I read the new Carry On Screaming and wrote to Peter Rogers that I didn't want to play another old character. If he offers to make the age younger, I'll do it. Not otherwise. I'd rather play my own age, which I think is so on brand for Kenneth Williams. To find that little thing to hold on to, quite vain.
They worked a lot together, actually, Kenneth Williams and Fenella Fielding. And there's a story that Kenneth Williams used to tell all the time, which was the fact that Fenella Fielding said to him one day, "Why is your bum so hard? Do you leave it out at night?" And she said in the commentary, I think, to Carry On Screaming, that she used to pinch his bottom, and his bum was hard for somebody who didn't do any exercise. So maybe that's my second interesting fact.
His taut posterior.
His taut posterior, yes, not muscular, just hard.
Yeah, I was just thinking he could just have a bony bum. Yeah. That on Halloween as well. That he was kind of going back and forth about deciding whether to be in the film or not, depending on how young he could be.
Well, I think if you put Thesiger and William side by side, they could be father and son. From that point of view.
So we come to our final takes on Visiting Hattie. And I think my final take is very short and sweet. I really enjoyed the story. I enjoyed revisiting it alongside the story suggestions, but the film suggestions, just because a more benign or a less gory story is with so much fun and heart to it. I just love being immersed in the world of Carry On, the world of Hattie Jacques. So my final take really was that, just the value of humor within ghost stories. I really think, this is very different and a bit tangential, but is Garth Marenghi. I like reading the Matt Holness, Garth Marenghi stories that he writes. They're a little bit more wild and crazy, but there is a place for it. And people who take their ghost stories too seriously, I think they're missing out.
Well, I think mine would be just celebrate life. Food, sex, laughter, company, having fun. But most of all, laughter. I think, because I watched Carry On Screaming the other night, and I just love the gags. They're funny, and they stand up. And thank you, Hattie, for all the wonderful characters that you played in the Carry On series. Oh, matron. My tease for my take on M.R. James, which is called The Portrait of a Looking Glass, is the fact that, and here's little M.R. James there, you can see him, young M.R. James. My tease is that I sent The Portrait of a Looking Glass to a friend of mine, and he said, "You have written a ghost story that is about a supernatural glory hole.